Hi guys. This is not my usual content, I know, and I will return to that content shortly. But as a history YouTuber who specializes in military history, with my personal focuses being the study of World War II in the East and the history of aerial warfare, the current situation has compelled me to actually sit down and look at the events unfolding. We are, in fact, entering a new historical era. A new world order, such as it is approaching us. And given the events of the previous week, as the saying so often goes, those who fail to learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. Now, as for why this war has started, as far as the political, geopolitical, and socio-economic situation, while I'll have to cover it in a broad sense, that topic is too complex and, quite frankly, too politically and emotionally charged to discuss in detail, and there are people who can do it far better than I. This is especially prescient given that as of this very moment, Ukrainian children are literally dying from Russian shell fire. So I do not want to enter into a political discussion. Suffice to say, if there is such a thing as a good guy in this war, it is the brave men and women of Ukraine who are resisting the invasion of their homeland by a foreign power. But like all wars before it, when taken as a whole geopolitical situation, it's one huge grey area with both Russia and the West treating Ukraine like a football, kicking it around between each other. Nevertheless, imperialism and aggressive war of any kind is to be condemned, no matter who does it, no matter the context. Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, wherever, whenever. So while I'm going to try avoiding bias and politics in this video as much as I can, I'm going to say this now to make my personal position very, very clear. And I'm going to borrow some words from much braver and better men and women than me. Rossia fascisti, idia nahue! Anyway, on to the video proper. Russian forces initiated the invasion of Ukraine after over a month of military build-up, ostensibly, as always in these circumstances, under the pretext of exercises. For the entirety of the Cold War, exercises close to NATO and Warsaw Pact borders were common practice on both sides to apply diplomatic and political pressure, as well as to raise tensions with the threat of invasion. Russian political objectives were stated officially by the Kremlin as denazification. This was ostensibly driven by Ukraine's prevalence of far-right militias and ultranationalist movements throughout the course of 2014 until the present, both in the Ukrainian government and the militias formed to fight the civil war in the Donbass. These movements include groups such as Svoboda, Right Sector, the Azov Battalion, and others. The other justification given by the Kremlin is the demilitarization of Ukraine as a buffer state between the Russian Federation and NATO. The goal being to prevent Ukraine's potential membership in NATO and the EU, which, geopolitically, would pose an unacceptable threat to Russian national security, as that would place NATO and EU forces less than a day's drive from Moscow. Both of these official objectives were chosen as the public face of this war by the Russians in order to give them legitimacy, given that both of these claims are the only ones that have a strong basis in documented evidence, especially regarding the NATO expansion issue. However, since the ascension of Zelensky's government in 2019, the ultranationalist right has been forced out of major positions of power in the senior echelons of Ukraine's leadership, with the former Speaker of the House and the Interior Minister, both open far-right activists with ties to neo-Nazis, having been removed. And considering they now have a Jewish president, and the far right got less than 1% of the vote in their previous election, while not fully rectified given that Azov Battalion as well as other extremist elements and institutions remain, it does illustrate that Ukraine and its people have taken substantive action to curb far-right extremism. So this is simply an element of Russian political maskirovka to justify their invasion. Putin's suspected true aims of this are seen in his public statements and political treatises written prior to this point, asserting that Ukraine is not a sovereign state, does not have a culture of its own, and is in reality the territory of a greater Russian homeland, and that their subjugation and integration is part of the planned resurgence of Russia as a world power, which is the primary goal of Putin's regime. This ethno-nationalist rhetoric rings very close to that of the regime they are ostensibly claiming to be taking direct action against, given that Putin's views around the former member states of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire are somewhat close to the discount Charlie Chaplin's views of Austria and the Sudetenland, with the ultimate goal of becoming a monocultural, ethno-hegemonic superpower. Alright. That's the end of the political discussion. But war is, as they say, political policy by other means. It was unavoidable, and thus I needed to clarify these issues to give you context. In reality, as I said at the start, I just want to make sure you get this across. The background to this is way more complex and nuanced, and that is way beyond the scope of this video. Please check out more qualified individuals than me regarding it. But speaking of the scope, let's get into the actual scope of the video by laying out the Russians' most likely military objectives and political objectives based on public statements from the Kremlin, intelligence gathered or captured by Ukrainian and NATO assets, and Russia's conduct in the field to date. First and foremost, their primary objective: the destruction of Ukraine as a sovereign state and their integration into the Russian Federation's sphere of influence directly via regime change. The form of this regime change most likely resembling a client state akin to Lukashenko's Belarus, thereby denying Ukraine access to both the EU and NATO. Their second primary objective: the destruction of anti-Russian military organizations in Ukraine, namely the armed forces of Ukraine and the National Guard units engaged in the Donbass region. Third, integration of Donetsk and Luhansk into the Russian Federation as autonomous regions under Kremlin control. And fourth, the protection, expansion, and re-establishment of long-term strategic Russian interests, gas pipelines, natural resources, trade lanes, and the resumption of water flow from the Dnieper River into Crimea. The Russian occupation of Crimea since 2014 having caused this flow of water to be cut by the Ukrainian government, causing shortages and drought across the peninsula. To accomplish these military and political objectives, the Russian armed forces have assembled between 170,000 and 190,000 personnel across all branches in 117 battalion tactical action groups, with a heavy focus on armoured and air assault assets, including numerous guards formations of all types, both armoured, motorised and mechanised, and the VDV. They also concentrated a significant number of air assets to achieve air supremacy over the battle space in order to support a rapid armoured movement into the country. These formations, operating under traditional Russian Soviet doctrine, were detailed to launch concentric advances throughout the country in various deep battle operations in order to split the nation's defences apart. These would be supported by air assaults on key installations, information and cyber warfare by national intelligence assets, namely the FSB or the GRU, and the destruction of critical Ukrainian logistics infrastructure, reserve units, and command and control installations via precision munitions from artillery, cruise missiles, and airstrikes. According to documents taken from a senior Russian officer by Ukrainian forces, the operational tempo and timetable for the completion of what was named the Ukrainian Defensive Security Operation was to last 2 weeks, from the 20th of February until the 6th of March. However, most likely logistical challenges and political developments delayed the commencement of operations by 4 days. Their movement plan, according to the lines of advance to date and the leaked plans from captured sources, as well as the television broadcast from Belarus's President Lukashenko and his completely uncensored operational map, are focusing on securing the main supply routes throughout the country, with the ultimate goal of isolating eastern Ukraine from NATO to the west, in order to cut off aid and supplies to insurgents. This would then allow for a full-scale follow-on mop-up operation. This involves a mechanized advance from north to south and south to north, with their anchor point being Kiev. Taking Kiev is the supreme tactical objective. As the nation's capital, it holds all critical state functions, their primary military headquarters, and forms the spiritual and economic center of the country, with its most important national monuments, including the Maidan Square, which has become a symbol of Ukrainian defiance. Not to mention, it houses, at the time of this video, given the man's gravitational singularity-inducing manhood, the head of the Ukrainian government, President Volodymyr Zelensky, whose capture or death would be a massive strategic and propaganda victory. With all of this information in mind, let us move to the invasion itself. Please note, as this situation is ongoing, some information is not 100% confirmed. Until the cessation of hostilities and the historical record has had time to be exhaustively compiled, we won't have the full story. This information has been collected from various sources, the two main ones being LiveMap and Ukraine Equipment Tracker, who have been documenting destroyed or captured equipment with photo verification and geolocation, along with various other sources and timelines documenting the events. At dawn, 0300 Zulu time or Greenwich Mean Time, February 24th, 2022, the Russian armed forces initiated a preparatory bombardment of key military and government targets inside Ukraine, with precision ordnance from strike aircraft, artillery, and cruise missile systems, with extensive focus on Ukrainian air defenses, such as air bases, SAM systems, and radar installations. The other priority targets were headquarters buildings of both civilian and military type. In border regions and population centers, and important logistical hubs such as Mariupol, Kharkov, Chernihiv, and Sumy, regional capitals, Russian forces attacked with artillery and MLRS systems. Simultaneously, sabotage attacks and cyber attacks were also reported in synchronization with the assault. At daybreak, Russian ground forces crossed the border and proceeded to move to their objectives. These advances were covered by frontal aviation assets, attack helicopters, and tactical fighters. Initial contact was made with Ukraine's border guard units, which quickly fell back or were destroyed in place. Given the concentration of forces and being at their launch point, Russian unit integrity and logistical capability were at full strength. As such, progress on the first day for the mechanized forces was swift. Armored units broke through the border defenses and immediately moved to their objectives. The Ukrainian government immediately ordered full mobilization of what amounted to the entire country and its population to resist the invasion, putting the armed forces at a war footing, involving the activation of all units comprising both the Army and National Guard, and the immediate scramble of the Ukrainian Air Defense Fighter Force. Ukrainian Air Force MiG-29s were filmed conducting a combat air patrol over Kiev, and given this fact, it would be safe to assume that the Ukrainian Air Force's Sukhoi 27s were also involved in intercepting Russian aircraft during the initial air campaign, successfully contesting Ukrainian airspace, resulting in multiple air-to-air engagements with losses on both sides. Results of these engagements are unclear due to the fog of war and the lack of third-party verification, but US officials with access to data from E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft monitoring the conflict indicate that the Ukrainian air defense was degraded but remained intact and is combat effective against Russian forces. Ukrainian artillery units, both gun and MLRS, began engaging Russian assembly areas, inflicting damage on mechanized columns in an attempt to stall the advance. The Russian mechanized forces, in keeping with deep battle and modern armored doctrine, bypassed strong points of Ukrainian resistance, proceeding down highways and major roads, encircling the city of Konotop in the process. However, in attempting to seize the city by direct assault during the advance, Russian units were violently repelled by the defenders, with considerable losses. This results in several Russian units being forced to withdraw and regroup for an organized assault to take the city, which falls the next day on the 25th. This small incident, taking place in the opening hours of the invasion, is a microcosm for the entire operational and tactical situation that will unfold. Namely, Russia, with its abundance of equipment and personnel, can and most likely will achieve victory and accomplish their objectives, but the cost will be exorbitant and perhaps even untenable. As the morning proceeded, elements of the 11th and 31st Guards Air Assault Brigade moved on Antonov Airport in Hostomel via helicopter assault through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, occupying the airfield in order to airlift reinforcements via helicopter and transport aircraft to threaten the capital Kiev. However, by now, Ukrainian forces had been alerted. 3 helicopters were lost during the assault with all the men on board. The Russian forces managed to capture the airfield. However, due to the threat that this airfield would pose to the Ukrainian defense plans, a quick reaction force deployed from Kiev and launched an aggressive counterattack. This attack destroyed the Russian landing force in its entirety, reclaiming the field. During the fighting, the world's largest aircraft, the Antonov 225 Myra, was destroyed, along with severe damage to the airfield. Ukrainian troops, in order to prevent the field from falling into Russian control in any decent condition, due to the main armoured offensive advancing on Kiev from Belarus, destroy the airfield and its facilities, denying its use to heavy-lift fixed-wing aircraft. It is now reduced only to be able to receive helicopters. As Russian troops advance on the capital, Chernobyl power plant falls under their control, after intense infantry firefights through the abandoned city of Pripyat. Simultaneously, a Ukrainian naval installation on Snake Island came under attack from units of the Russian Navy of the Black Sea Fleet. When surrender was demanded, the Ukrainian defenders replied, "Russian warship, go F yourself." The defenders are neutralized by bombardment and naval infantry, and the island is now occupied by the Russians. By the end of the first day, Russian gains have been substantial, reaching multiple major cities or making significant progress towards them. The ones of note being Mariupol, Kharkov, Sumy, Cherniv, the outer regions of Kiev, and the outer regions of Kherson. However, in achieving this, Russian units have outpaced their fixed AA defenses and their logistical supply columns, which, due to the majority of forward-deployed units being combat troops, by necessity, this means their supply units were firmly still behind the Russian border. On the 25th, Russian forces reached Kherson, Chernihiv, Kharkov, and the far northern metro area of Kiev. Upon capturing the dam blocking the water supply to Crimea, Russian combat engineers immediately blew it up, restoring water to the peninsula. Simultaneously, as part of the Kherson offensive, Russian troops began a blitzkrieg operation to the east in order to link up with separatist forces, and an amphibious assault being launched on Mariupol. US intelligence sources in the Sea of Azov confirmed thousands of Marines assaulting the city alongside militia units from the separatist republics. But after the lackluster performance by the Russian air forces and the armoured units outrunning their logistical tails due to light resistance, the Ukrainian plan had come into effect. In anticipation of the Russians practicing deep battle, with some allowances made for the modernization of Russia's armed forces since the collapse of the USSR, the senior Ukrainian staff also trained and saw service as part of the Red Army, meaning that unlike in other global conflicts, the Ukrainians speak a similar language. Usually they are both bilingual in Ukrainian and Russian. They come from the same military and economic background, the same geopolitical sphere, and have fought 2 of history's largest wars, multiple civil wars on their home soil, and one in Afghanistan, as part of the same army as the people invading. Thus, they have an in-depth knowledge of how the Russians are going about this. And so, planning around their knowledge of the Russian way of war, Ukrainian forces had dug in on the major lines of advance towards Kiev, while simultaneously mobilizing and arming the entire population to resist the invasion. They allowed Russian units to get far into the country, stretching their units out, running them out of supplies, and then digging in on strong points that Russian forces are unable to bypass and forced to take. Namely logistic hubs with rail and road interchanges, port cities, and cities on major rivers, the most vital of those rivers, of course, being the Dnieper, a river which I have started dubbing the river that vanquishes armies, as the Red Army, the Wehrmacht, and multiple Russian Civil War armies, even going back as far as the Great Northern War's Swedish Army and Ottoman incursions. This river has been the defensive line and the vice-like trap in Ukraine for centuries. Moreover, due to the Ukrainian Air Force having been able to survive the initial invasion and reorganize, they now had large columns of Russian vehicles, as well as their logistics train, outside of their air defense screen. That ends the blow-by-blow of the first 2 days of the invasion, but I thought that would give you an idea of where we are leading up to this point. Because most of you have been watching the news and have seen the reports coming out of Ukraine, and have seen the photographs taken. The one I have up on screen are from across the entire battlefront in multiple locations, with the aid of Western-provided weapon systems having been sent in ridiculous numbers during the build-up, most notably ATGMs and MADPADs, Javelins, Stingers, NLAWs, and others. The Russian advance forces were halted and then subsequently obliterated in local counterattacks, defensive actions, and in resistance strikes. There are even reports of Ukrainian forces launching a counterattack against Milarovo Air Base inside Russia. Ukrainian air assets, meanwhile, such as the Su-25, Su-24 tactical fighters, Mi-24s and Mi-8 helicopters, and most effectively, the Turkish-built TB2 Bayraktar, UCAV or drone, have been able to achieve temporary local air superiority and deliver strikes on Russian convoys and logistics. Having the NATO-provided anti-tank and vehicle systems, as well as being thoroughly trained on Soviet and Russian equipment, Ukrainian regular army forces have been defending highways, cities, and bridge crossings. Some of those bridge crossings needing to be destroyed to halt Russian forces. One of these was achieved by one man, Vitaly Skakun Vladimirovich, a Ukrainian Marine who detonated a bridge with both himself and the Russians on it. A sacrifice which allowed his comrades to fall back and regroup to a more defensible position. National Guard and resistance units, meanwhile, have been again striking the Russian supply chain and hitting soft targets in the rear. With only 190,000 men at their disposal and the Ukrainian regular forces still in the field, Russian troops cannot guard, secure, and ensure the safety of their rear areas, resulting in heavy resistance to occupation, civil unrest, and National Guard units infiltrating their lines or laying ambushes for recon units and supply columns. The result, as you can see, has been carnage. These images show entire convoys wrecked by Ukrainian drone strikes. Others show Ukrainian territorial defense units capturing fully intact tanks, APCs, and MLRS systems. We have footage of Ukrainian civilians capturing abandoned vehicles by towing them with their tractors. And we have seen everything. We have seen every form of equipment, from late model T-80 main battle tanks, BMP-2s, BMP-3s, Tunguska, Oza and Pantsir AA systems, T-90s, Ka-52 and Hind attack helicopters, all of this equipment being destroyed, captured, or even just abandoned on the side of the road. Footage from Kharkov shows Ukrainian troops ambushing and destroying an entire Russian vehicle convoy, advancing into a built-up defended area without any armoured or air support. Russian soldiers who have been captured, as well as the mobile phones of Russian soldiers killed in action, have shown reports of running out of food and fuel, as well as an impression that Russian troops have very low morale or are straight up lied to and threatened regarding their part in the invasion. Footage of a Ukrainian civilian talking to Russian troops by the side of the road that went viral shows them casually telling what is essentially an enemy civilian that they ran out of gas, and when the civilian asks if they're going to attack the capital, they respond with what appears to be genuine shock. They can't believe that they're launching this invasion. All over the place, Ukrainian forces have been seeing situations like this, and Russian casualties as a result have been horrendous. As this is a developing situation, I will not go over the precise numbers in the commentary, as by the time this video comes out it will most likely have changed, so any graphics regarding casualties and equipment losses will be added just before rendering an upload. Essentially, the Ukrainian forces know that if the Russians want to win, they're going to have to split the country in half, cutting them off from NATO supply. And while Russia does not have the men and equipment in place to achieve a total quarantine of the country, if that access is even slightly restricted, there will be devastating tactical and strategic consequences. And so the Ukrainians have three primary objectives of their own. First, prevent Russian armoured spearheads from link up at all costs, especially around Kiev. 2. Hold as many major cities as possible and force the Russians into either sieges or house-to-house fighting. Prolonging the war makes it more expensive in blood and treasure for the invading force, while allowing Western sanctions to do their work. It also makes NATO intervention more likely while allowing more time for them to send military aid. And third, hold Western Ukraine at all costs. This objective links into the other two. Holding Western Ukraine will allow for the Ukrainian Air Force to keep flying sorties, while also keeping the borders open for NATO aid and potentially reinforcements to enter the country. Without going into a full chronological blow-by-blow of the war up to now, which is hard to do at this stage, the situation has shifted into a conventional war of siege, indiscriminate use of firepower, and house-to-house, field-to-field fighting. So the question that everybody is asking, and what tons of videos have popped up on YouTube about, including mine, is how the hell did all of this happen? And why is one of the world's strongest military powers, the Russian Federation, the inheritor to the Soviet Union, why are they doing so terribly? There are lots of factors that play into the initial failure of the Russian forces. Part of it is simply incompetence and the lack of preparation. We have confirmed reports of the Russian tactical radio frequencies, up to the battalion level, being completely unencrypted. In a country where everyone can speak your language and has the same type of Soviet radios you do. This has led to some hilarious moments of shit-talking between Russian and Ukrainian troops, but it also allows for the Ukrainian forces, both standing army and irregulars, to listen in on Russian comms and position themselves accordingly. Likewise, Russian artillery and air assets have failed to cut off power and have not jammed or otherwise seriously compromised cell phone and satellite coverage, meaning that Ukrainian regular and irregular forces are able to keep in touch and upload images to Twitter, Facebook, and other social media, allowing for open source intelligence gatherers to geolocate Russian positions using satellite map data. We have even reports of Ukrainian women tracking Russian troop movements via geolocation on Tinder. I know this sounds ridiculous, but those of you who are veterans or serving military have probably all got a story when you and your best mate were playing war games and your best mate's playing Op4 and he's forgotten to turn off his phone, and so Snapchat is still broadcasting his location. 11 Bravo, my best friend of 12 years and former US Army infantryman, has more than one story of him killing his friends on Op4 by calling in artillery or airstrikes using his Snapchat map. Likewise, my friend in the Australian Special Forces community, who for obvious reasons shall remain nameless, has confirmed doing this with Australian forces in training as well as using other methods like it. In fact, 11 Bravo and other US veterans can tell you about ICOM chatter during the Afghan War on Terror, and how they have walked mortars or airstrikes onto target based on intercepted radio calls such as, "They just hit in front of us," or "The Americans are half a mile west of us." This free flowing of information on the internet and their use of unencrypted communications has led to ambushes, interdiction strikes, and accurate artillery, taking out Russian targets both at the front and in the rear lines. There is also the level of training and experience to consider. Russia still uses mass conscription, and unlike the Soviet Union, these conscription periods are often only for a year to facilitate the creation of a national reserve, rather than the maintenance and supplementation of a fully trained and equipped professional army. The idea being that they have a fundamental set of training skills, and so when a time of war occurs, it allows them to be folded into the regular army while they'll gain experience on the job. This is in contrast to the Red Army, which had 3-year enlistment periods for all men, allowing for a large standing force of decently trained troops. This inexperienced conscript army has another issue as well: a lack of combat-tested NCOs and officers. The last major deployment of the Russian armed forces in combat was in Georgia in 2008, 14 years ago, with only smaller overseas deployments to Syria for their special operations units. Chechnya was in 1991, 30 years ago, and before that Afghanistan, 40 years ago. Meaning that the squad and platoon level NCOs and officers would most likely have no actual combat experience, and the ones that do would be in small-scale operations such as security patrols in Syria, the Crimean annexation, or counter-terrorism inside the Russian Federation. Full-scale conventional and guerrilla war is not something that they would be ready for. Compare this to Ukrainian troops, who deployed with American and NATO forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, while also performing peacekeeping missions in Africa and have been fighting a civil war since 2014, which resulted in the formation of a massive National Guard and the enlargement of its conventional forces. To give some idea of how poorly Russian forces have been conducting the basics of military operations, this is footage from a Ukrainian TV-2 Bayraktar drone. Here we can see a Russian convoy, fully equipped with short to medium range anti-air systems. In fact, the drone is, as we see in this footage, targeting a Book SAM system in this clip. The idea that this convoy, stuck in traffic in an actively resisting, occupied country with a contested airspace, doesn't have its escorting gun trucks or its SAMs or even its self-propelled anti-aircraft guns deployed, to the extent that the enemy can park a drone directly over your AA systems, those things are put there precisely to stop happening, and then destroy them. I mean, this is an indicator that the Russian forces deployed are either incompetent or incredibly overconfident. In fact, given the evidence from across the board regarding breakdowns in discipline, including looting, desertions, surrenders, as well as breakdowns in logistics, lack of food and fuel, it would be a fair assessment, I think, to assume that the troops are inexperienced, incompetent, and undisciplined, while their leaders were overconfident and unprepared. So, in reality, it's both. Then, there is their equipment. Some Ukrainian troops who have captured Russian vehicles have commented in shock that the Russian gear is more dilapidated and out of date than their own. Footage of captured vehicles lends credence to this, with visible rust and out-of-date equipment that is obviously very late Soviet vintage. One noticeable trend shows T-80BVs and T-80Us, tanks brought out of the National Reserves dating back to the Soviet Union. This also ties into the logistical issues, as the T-80 also has one of the major operational problems for the already logistically challenged Russian forces. Unlike the T-72B3 and the T-90, the T-80 series of tanks uses a gas turbine engine like the Abrams, and as such, their fuel consumption is a lot higher. Which, when you consider resistance units and standoff strikes are devastating all of your resupply, it's not a good move to bring those tanks. It is, of course, the most likely reason we seem to find this type of tank abandoned more than the others. Even so, with all the Russian vehicles among their operational woes, they should be capable of performing their mission. Except the anti-tank systems used by the Ukrainians, provided by NATO, are so effective that vehicle losses across the board have been borderline catastrophic. And as the defenders obviously plan to draw Russian forces into city fighting, these losses are only going to get worse. In fact, this clip of a Ukrainian National Guardsman illustrates exactly why you don't move unescorted armor and vehicles into a contested urban environment.
Просим вас сохранять спокойствие, спуститься по лестничной клетке на первый этаж и выйти на улицу.
Finally, and most importantly, is the notable absence of the Russian Air Force. Military Aviation History, Bismarck, did 2 very good videos on this topic, which I will link in the description. But the lack of significant close air support for their forces, and most confusingly, the lack of combat air patrols, have allowed the Ukrainian Air Force to not only mount a defense to contest the airspace, but to actually conduct operations against the advancing Russian forces. Not only that, making allowances for overclaiming, which is endemic in air combat and has been since its inception, Ukrainian air defenders have managed to inflict losses on Russian air operations to a significant degree. The ghost of Kiev has proven to be a myth. However, the heroism and tenacity of the Ukrainian air defense forces, both fighter pilots and SAM operators, is not in doubt for a moment. With the Ukrainians reporting that at least one of their Sukhoi 27 flanker pilots, Colonel Alexander Okashenko, achieved 7 air-to-air victories over both fixed-wing and rotary aircraft before being killed in aerial combat. The success of the Ukrainians mounting this defense is down to its integrated nature and conservative operational concept. They only hit what they know they can hit, and they stay inside their air defense envelope, waiting for their moment. It is also suspected, but unconfirmed, that with US Air Force E-3 sentries flying standing patrols along the Romania-Poland-Ukraine border, that they are receiving and provided with real-time tactical information of Russian air operations and are being accurately and efficiently vectored. However, I want to stress that this is unable to be confirmed and is only suspected for obvious reasons. But seeing as a considerable amount of Ukraine's air defense radar net was destroyed on the opening day of the invasion, along with a substantial number of their fighters, as seen in this footage here, it stands to reason that given the Ukrainian Air Force has performed so well, this form of plausibly deniable tactical support would be a good option for NATO to assist in Ukraine's air defense, given they have ruled out a no-fly zone. And it would go some way to explaining the Ukrainian Air Force's fighter successes. That said, though, Ukrainian air losses have been heavy. This is a confirmed shoot-down of a Ukrainian Su-25 Frogfoot. There are also confirmed sightings of an Il-39 trainer aircraft, the Delphin, made by Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, being used as a tactical bomber. So they have essentially resorted to strapping bombs on their tactical trainers. However, in a ghost from the past, the real danger for the Russians is the same one that haunted their nightmares during their war in Afghanistan. MANPADS. Man-Portable Anti-Air Defense Systems, aka the Stinger. NATO has confirmed they will supply FIM-92 Stinger missiles to Ukraine, while former Warsaw Pact nations are handing over their entire stock of Soviet-era Strela and Igla systems. We have already seen them at work with high numbers of damaged and destroyed Russian helicopters. Unfortunately for the Russians, seeing as this is an infrared threat that does not trigger radar-activated early warning systems, and it's a threat that is easily moved, concealed, and employed, and is able to target almost all forms of close air support assets, the only real way to deal with this threat is to operate at higher altitudes, reducing weapon efficiency, while coming under threat from medium to long-range air defense like Buks, Tors, and S-100s and S-300s, expend an incredibly high number of flares, and inflict heavy casualties on Ukrainian infantry and resistance units. And, of course, none of that helps the helicopters. And if they want to keep flying helicopter operations, and they will have to, losses will continue to mount. It will be attritional and brutal. However, the Russian Air Force's woes do not end with the actions of their enemies. Their operational capability is increasingly hampered by maintenance and reliability issues. Sanctions that have been in place since 2014 have affected the amount of money available for spares, replacement parts, and covering the standard operating costs with their associated maintenance and training schedules. This is exacerbated by the fact that due to their high performance at affordable cost design, stemming from their Soviet doctrine and heritage, older Russian high-performance airframes, such as the MiG-29 and Sukhoi 27, require extensive maintenance and overhauls. Not only that, Russian pilots, due to all of these budgetary restrictions, have difficulty meeting their minimum flight hour requirements. However, this is mitigated by the fact that Russian pilots posted to Syria have accumulated decent levels of combat flight time while sharing an airspace with NATO operations. All of this being said, at the time of writing, March 5th, 2022, Russian air operations have begun to escalate, with extensive Russian air presence being recorded across the country in both night and day operations, while Ukrainian forces on the ground have desperately requested NATO air cover, which they have been informed they won't get. due to fears of escalating the conflict into a global war. Furthermore, the more advanced Russian air assets, Tupolev 160 Blackjacks, Tu-22M Backfires, Su-57 Felons, and MiG-35s have not made their appearance in the conflict yet, most likely due to fears of them being lost in action and falling into NATO hands. But the high level of resistance, the survival of Ukraine's air force, and the current operational losses may lead them to deploy these units, at which time and in which case the situation will deteriorate rapidly for the Ukrainians. As stated earlier, Russia simply has more assets and troops than the Ukrainians have weapons and territory. If they choose to use them, which is becoming more and more likely given recent statements from Putin that things will get worse, Russia will, by brute force, accomplish its objectives, and the air component of that operation will be vital. So with all the above factors taken into consideration regarding the Russian forces, it would seem that this is just the failure of a paper tiger, and that it most definitely is. But there are two other major factors affecting the performance of Russian forces. One of them is man-made, the other is environmental, and both are interlinked, operationally and historically. The time of year Russia chose to invade, and the infrastructure layout of the former Soviet Union. The invasion was scheduled for February 20th, but was delayed by 4 days to February 24th. Climactically speaking, this places the invasion during the transition from winter to spring. And of all the times of year to launch large-scale military operations in Eastern Europe, this is the absolute worst time to do it. The Russian winter is harsh. It has killed more than one army in its time. From Napoleon Bonaparte to Franz Halder, everyone learns that you don't fight in Russia during the winter unless you're Finnish. And even if you are a Finn, you either need a backup plan or some madman who can take a grenade to the face and still snipe from half a mile with iron sights. But for all its horrors, in mechanized warfare, if you can keep your vehicles going, the winter still allows for tactical mobility and offensive operations. It's what comes before and after winter, the onset and recession of seasons, that causes real problems. The Rasputitsa. During Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Wehrmacht made incredible progress along their central axis of advance towards Moscow. Through various encirclement battles at Smolensk, Minsk, and Kiev, they had managed enormous tactical victories, killing or capturing over 1 million Soviet troops and securing the city which today is causing Russia so much trouble. But as summer turned to autumn or fall, the pre-winter rains began. What followed was a quagmire, turning the entirety of the Eastern Front into thick, sludgy mud. Both Axis and Soviet forces were brought to an almost complete standstill, unable to conduct any mechanized operations at all. This situation benefited the defenders, as the Wehrmacht momentum was completely halted, while they didn't even have to move. They could use this pause to dig in, but likewise, any reinforcements for them had to come by rail and then march up through the mud to the front. And as the USSR only had maybe 5 sealed highways in total at the time, this meant that both sides had to rely on roads that had been churned by the rain, marching troops and driving vehicles into what amounts to a spontaneous swamp. This situation happens twice a year, during the autumn rains leading into winter, and its more brutal encore, when the masses of Russian snow and ice melts. The spring thaw. Now consider Ukraine. It is the southern part of Eastern Europe, on a similar latitude to northern Italy and southern France. The climate in Ukraine makes it ideal for growing crops, especially grain, as it provides, I think, about 30% of Europe's total grain production. So you have all this soft, loamy soil, ideal for farming. You have the Black Sea and the European plain to give you a climate for soft, smooth rain showers. And as a result of this climate, the spring thaw hits a little bit earlier and a little bit harder. As such, you get this. This is a TOS-1 Buratino MLRS system, firing thermobaric warheads, the infamous vacuum bomb that the US media has been discussing since their use was recorded during the conflict. This Buratino seems fully operational, intact and loaded, according to the sources who took this photo. No battle damage could be seen at all, but if you look at the photo closely and at the ground behind it and the state of its tracks, my guess would be this track was abandoned due to being stuck. In fact, we have footage of the ground in various areas of Ukraine. It is a sea of mud. Launching mechanized assaults in this terrain would be absolutely nightmarish, and it would have the same result as those seen in World War II, such as this Tiger 1 here. A lot of big, heavy, expensive superweapon-like hardware, mission killed by the dirt. Therefore, the only way to carry out operations in these conditions is by using the roads. However, as mentioned before, at the time of World War II, the Soviet Union did not have many sealed highways. Surely over the years, and with the powerful Soviet industrial machine, this infrastructure was improved, right? Well, about that. Given the fact that everything west of Moscow and Volgograd, formerly named Stalingrad, was razed to the ground by the Nazis or destroyed in combat, the majority of the Soviet Union's resources for reconstruction came in the form of reparations from East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary, or from their own products and exports. Namely, they had to impoverish themselves and the entirety of Eastern Europe just to rebuild what was destroyed. This meant, of course, that the focus was on reconstruction, and thus massive housing programs were conducted because the surviving Soviet people didn't have anywhere to live, resulting in the stereotypical Soviet apartment blocks that we all know and love. And as this was the height of the Cold War, the other focuses were, of course, defense spending and the space race, meaning that Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian, Romanian, Polish, all of these roads, while having been expanded and sealed to a greater extent over the past 80 years, are still far behind when it comes to other nations. Furthermore, due to the sheer size of these Eastern European nations like Ukraine and Belarus, time and money needs to be invested in big, long highways and freeways and long-running train tracks, running the spine of the country's main economic centers, rather than in dense, well-organized and interlinked networks of cities and towns. If you look at Russia, Moscow acts like a sort of wheel, with the freeways and highways being spokes to different major centers. This translates across all Soviet-planned roadmaps. If we compare Ukraine here to Germany, you can see the difference in road density. Soviet and later Russian doctrine, in terms of deep battle and military maneuvers, is designed around large-scale operational maneuvers and blitzkrieg-type warfare in Western Germany, via the Fulda Gap and the northern German plain. In these areas, they have plenty of roads, sidings, on and off ramps, alongside the obvious massive autobahns. They have all of this infrastructure to move troops rapidly up to the front and then force a breakthrough, which they can then use to drive to the Rhine. For operations in their own territory and in Eastern Europe, however, the limited road network makes this impossible, especially in this weather. And the Ukrainians know this. This limited road network, combined with Soviet urban planning, means that all the major cities that are or have been heavily defended by Ukrainian forces, I'm including the ones that have fallen like Sumy and Kherson, such as Kharkov, Chernihiv, Sumy, Dnipro, all of these cities are major highway interchanges and rail hubs. All of the local logistics and infrastructure are dependent on these places. If Russia doesn't take these locations, it introduces two huge problems. First, it means you have to route your supply columns around the ring roads, stretching your line of supply and causing huge traffic jams, because everybody's going to be forced to go down one smaller road instead of using the big ones that run through town. The other bigger problem number two, this means you're running your logistics train right next to a heavily fortified enemy stronghold, armed to the teeth with modern ATGMs and Ukrainians who were either Civil War veterans or former Red Army soldiers, who could probably teach Jamshid a thing or two about the RPG-7. And as we have seen by the number of destroyed trucks, to the extent that Russian forces have been seen commandeering local vehicles to supplement their supply convoys, this decision has proven to be very costly. Like the Wehrmacht before them, the Russians are discovering that when you combine the weather, the roads, and the ferocious tenacity of the residents, taking Ukraine is a long and bloody affair. For Army Group South, it was the ferocious battles on the Zhytomyr highway through the Stalin Line. For Russia, it is the long bloody trek down the P-02 through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where a convoy 3 lanes wide is backed up for miles and miles. The comparison to the German invasion of 1941 is an apt one in many ways. However, the one I shall end with is the campaign waged by the Ukrainian commander of the Kiev Military District and the Red Army Southwestern Front, Mikhail Petrovich Kirponos. The current defense being maintained by the Ukrainian forces bears striking parallels with the efforts of Southwestern Front and its commander. The major difference is, of course, the defense is facing eastwards. Kirponos led the Soviet forces in the Ukraine in an excellent fighting retreat. Of the 3 German army groups, the most difficult resistance faced by them to their advance was encountered on the advance into Ukraine. Using NKVD border guards and reserve units to soak up the initial German attack, Kirponos staged a gradual fallback across multiple lines of defense while launching local counterattacks where he could. He paid particular attention to holding road junctions and denying the use of main supply routes to the Germans. The enemy air superiority was devastating, but he maintained his composure. He fought Army Group South to a near standstill on multiple occasions, but with the collapsing front in Belarus, he had to fall back to Kiev. Once there, he led his troops in a desperate defense, and upon realizing the impending mass encirclement, he moved at the head of his men to attempt a breakout eastwards, losing his life in the process. But due to his defensive efforts, the Germans could not fully close the net, and many of his men escaped, some of them to rejoin the main Red Army, and others to form ruthless band of partisans from the remnants of other units. These partisans would plague German logistics trains, until the Red Army retook Ukraine in 1944. I felt his story is the appropriate one to sum up on, because sadly I think it is most likely one that will happen again. The resistance of Ukraine to the Russian invasion has been nothing short of remarkable. The initial losses among Russian forces from the aforementioned factors are almost certainly products of Putin assuming that his military would make Ukraine roll over and accept its fate. They did not. The Ukrainian people have determined that they will make a fight of it, with Molotov cocktails and broom handles if need be. Even today, at the time of writing, the Ukrainians confirmed they had killed a Russian major general in a sniper operation. The Ukrainian army still has its mechanized forces keeping the northern and southern advances at bay, and the Ukrainian Air Force is still flying sorties and striking targets. National Guard units are armed to the teeth with weapons of every kind, waiting in Ukraine's cities that the Russians will have to take, and they will take it at terrible cost. The Ukrainians refuse to lay down and die. But Russia is a global superpower, or at least the remnants of one, with millions of men, thousands of armored vehicles of all types, hundreds of aircraft, dozens of fleet-class warships, and a full arsenal of nuclear weapons to deter foreign intervention. The Russian bombing campaign has been intensified. The cities of Mariupol and Kharkov are under siege, being ruthlessly shelled and barraged with rockets. The people of Kiev have started erecting tank traps and fortifying buildings throughout their city in preparation for a house-to-house fight. and there are reports that the Russian Black Sea Fleet is massing off Crimea to mount amphibious assaults to finish Mariupol and also to take Odessa. Putin has made clear in conversations with the press, as well as other world leaders and with his military leadership, that given the decision of Ukraine to fight, he will pursue unrestricted warfare. He has made use of cluster bombs, thermobaric weapons, and has even posed a radiological threat with his actions around Ukraine's nuclear power plants. All the while, threatening NATO and the United States with nuclear retaliation should they intervene. Russian troops are massing around Kiev, forming forward operations bases, artillery positions, and a heavily fortified air defense zone. Like Kerponos before, the valiant defenders of Ukraine will fight for a long time, and they will fight hard. They will make the invaders pay for every inch. But when the invader has such overwhelming material superiority in the air and on the ground, and there aren't any reinforcements coming, short of a miracle or a total Russian collapse, they will be encircled, bombarded, and eventually crushed. Their only hope is to hold. Hold as long as they can. Make the cost in blood and treasure unaffordable, and make the sanctions really hurt, hopefully destroying Russian morale to the extent where Putin is forced to withdraw or is removed by his own government. But if Russia commits fully, and the Ukrainian defenses finally fall, there aren't nearly as many troops in this invasion as there were in the last one. The surviving Ukrainian forces will break out of the encirclement to the west to a free Ukrainian headquarters in Lvov and continue the fight. Or they will melt into the countryside, and the Russians will find out something else the Germans learned. Ukrainian partisans make even the toughest of men look over their shoulders. You never know where or when they will strike. But harnessing the spirit of another famous Ukrainian, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Lady Death, you know that they are watching, and you know that strike they will. And they will keep fighting until their nation is once again free from occupation. This war is a travesty. It should never have happened. We shouldn't have allowed it to happen. It should have been stopped. Everyone should have sat down and talked. But now that it has, for all of this, I have one last thing to say. And this is on a personal note. Over the centuries, Ukraine has been through countless hardships at the hands of tyrants, many of them being Russian. But twice in the previous century, as imperialist wars burned and ravaged across their homes, the average Russian and the average Ukrainian joined together in common cause to remove a tyrant king and his oligarchs, sending them straight to hell where they belong. I pray to any gods that may be listening that they can do so again. Thank you for watching. Slava Ukraine.